right, welcome everyone. I have such a special treat. My guest today is David Perlmutter, the empowering neurologist. He is a board certified neurologist, four-time New York Times best-selling author. He serves on the board of directors and is fellow of the American College of Nutrition. He is the expert in functional neurology and has been a mentor of mine, not knowing me, but he has so influenced my practice. Dr. Perlmutter, welcome aboard.
Well, Dr. Eckel, I am delighted to be with you today.
Thank you. Today's topic, we have our segment today. We have covered in this Brain Degeneration Summit all of the facets that you have put forth in your writing, in your lecturing, in your educating, from detox and heavy metal and diet and nutrition and grain-free eating. But I'm wondering from you specifically, how would you approach basically growing a new brain? If that was the pose, because we are seeing rates of chronic neurodegeneration go through the roof. What are the facets? How do you lay that out for folks in thinking through? And then we'll talk about ways to improve our brain function.
It's certainly a very intriguing question for me on multiple levels. First of all, from the perspective of the whole notion of growing back a brain. I mean, in my day, in my training, we were well convinced by what we were taught that the brain didn't have that ability to grow itself back, to regenerate, to form new synapses, to form, activate new connections between brain cells, etc. We were pretty well told that you got the brain you were going to have by about age 18 years of life. And at that point, pretty much it was on the skids for the rest of your life. And, we used to kid about, if every beer is 80,000 brain cells or whatever the magic number was, how are we still around doing the things that we're doing? But having said that, it took quite a bit of time for mainstream science to really embrace the notion that humans have the ability to grow new brain cells. While, even in the 70s and 80s, it was beginning to be recognized in rodents and subsequently in primates, the idea that we as humans could actually repopulate our brains with new viable stem cells that we produce all the time was really difficult for scientists to embrace until finally Dr. Erickson was working with patients who were receiving a chemical because of their skin cancer that labeled cells during the course of their division. And what they were treated with was an attempt to see how rapidly their facial cancers were spreading. And some of these individuals actually passed away. And what Dr. Erickson decided to do was to actually not only look at their skin that the other doctors were doing, but he, along with the Dr. Fred Gage in California, decided to look at their brains. And lo and behold, there were brain cells in the actively dividing and forming new brain cells as well. So this was the first demonstration that humans have this ability of what we call neurogenesis, the ability to grow new brain cells. And it took quite a bit of work for him to get that paper published because it was so controversial that many of the journals that he submitted the paper to just out and out rejected the whole idea and said this is ludicrous. Really almost on religious grounds that we just can't have this idea that humans are able to grow new brain cells. So ultimately it was published and it was groundbreaking. I mean, the idea that we have the ability to repopulate our brains with new fully viable cells that can further differentiate and become specialized was really a very challenging kind of notion and ultimately proved to be extremely empowering for people like yourself who are doing the work, allowing patients and individuals to know that, in fact, we have this ability. Taking the whole step further, then what can we do to enhance that ability, take full advantage of this idea of neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells, and neuroplasticity, the connection of brain cells, we can enhance that process. So we know that it's going on throughout our lifetimes. When we're in our 90s, it's going on. Certainly, it's far more active when we are younger, when we're children, even adolescents, but make no mistake about it, it continues lifelong. And the area that's been studied most where it occurs is actually called the hippocampus, which is deeply involved in our ability to form and retrieve memories. So it's strategically located in the very area that degenerates early on, for example, in Alzheimer's disease. So what a blessing it is that this was discovered, taking it further to the idea of then what can we do now to enhance this process. We understand that there are various factors that are involved in enhancing the growth of new brain cells. Certainly something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, has taken center stage as a trophic protein chemical miracle grow for the brain, it's been called. Maybe that makes it a little colloquial, but that said, that there are these factors that are floating around in our bodies that tend to stimulate the growth of new brain cells. Insulin-like growth factor being another one, IGF-1. And so we would then ask, if these are potent ways to increase the growth of new brain cells, and who wouldn't want that, then what can we do to enhance the presence of these chemicals, specifically BDNF? And as it turns out that another Dr. Erickson, Kirk Erickson, working at the University of Pittsburgh in collaboration with researchers at UCLA, has demonstrated that, in fact, some of our lifestyle factors are powerful influencers of BDNF and therefore have a very important role to play in our ability not just to grow new brain cells, but to improve our brain function. And he demonstrated, taking a group of 100 individuals, half of whom were given a 1-year stretching program to do. The other half was given a 1 year of aerobic exercise to do, amounting to approximately 20 minutes a day, that those individuals who engaged in the aerobic exercise demonstrated not only much higher levels of BDNF, the growth factor for the brain, but improved memory. And when they did MRI scans of their brains, they showed that their hippocampus, the brain's memory center, if you will, had actually increased in size in comparison to those who simply did stretching, in which case the hippocampus was seen to decline in size. So aerobic exercise, you can't put it in a bottle, powerful medicine that works to increase BDNF and therefore the growth of new brain cells. We've identified a number of factors that work to enhance BDNF. They include things like turmeric, for example, coffee, dietary restriction or caloric restriction, and as mentioned, being involved in aerobic exercise. Yeah. There's also some more exotic approaches like whole coffee fruit extract that has recently been discovered to increase BDNF as well. So we're really in a very new and exciting place as it relates to the question that you asked, the growth of new brain cells. Coming from, even during my medical training in the 1980s, a place of total rejection of that idea to where we are today, fully embracing that notion and really doing our best to get the word out that we can actually enhance the process. And without any doubt at all, that is going to be very neuroprotective, very good for us because, we're looking at the brain as kind of a balance between the rate of degeneration of brain cells and the rate of growth of new brain cells. My colleague, Dr. Dale Bredesen, has taken that concept even further and looked at the ways that brain cells connect, the synapses. And he says that we really ought to look at things in terms of those synapses, the rate of formation of new synapses versus the rate of loss of synapses. And we can enhance synaptic plasticity, the growth of synapses, by increasing BDNF as well. So why wouldn't you want to do it?
Yeah, that is awesome. And what a marvelous time to be alive. And a big component of why I put this Brain Degeneration Summit on is a lot of folks get these diagnoses, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, MS, and they're basically just pigeonholed and stuck. And one of the big goals is to bring out this information that no, we actually have this neuroplasticity. We're actually able to regrow our brains. And so that on that big piece, and I'm guessing because this was the biggest influence that you've had on my practice was around glutathione and heavy metals in particular. So I'm guessing for brain health, there is removal of obstacles to cure. And you've written extensively in your Grain Brain. Let's bring in those facets around what are the things that we can take off of, or we know that are damaging to our brains that we have control of.
I'd say that the two biggest factors that we should consider, and they're absolutely not mutually exclusive by any means, they actually enhance each other, are both inflammation and then what we call oxidative stress, or the action of oxy radicals, if you will. Inflammation is basically what it means. The brain is on fire. That's what the word means. Inflammation comes from inflammare, a Latin term meaning on fire. And we're all familiar with inflammation. It's the redness, pain, and swelling that comes from mosquito bite. That's an inflamed area of your skin or an inflamed joint with arthritis. But to be clear, Alzheimer's is an inflammatory disease of the brain, as is Parkinson's for that matter, MS. And we don't experience the pain and the redness and the swelling. So we're really less aware that inflammation is at work, but we know that clearly these are inflammatory diseases. Inflammatory markers like tumor necrosis factor alpha, C-reactive protein, are clearly correlated when they're elevated with both risk and progression of, for example, Alzheimer's disease. So, the relationship to inflammation is very clear, as is the relationship of inflammation to coronary artery disease, diabetes, and even cancer. The major killers of our planet. In fact, the number one cause of death on planet Earth, the chronic degenerative conditions, are inflammatory. So we have to ask ourselves, well, A, what is causing the inflammation? And B, what in the heck can we do to turn it down? That's what we need to do. We need to do everything we can to quell this fire. And I think that we understand that these are not genetic causes that we need to be concerned about. Are there, as it relates to Alzheimer's, vis-a-vis what we're talking about today, are there genetic risk factors? Of course there are. The presenilin 1 genes, for example, the APOE alleles 2, 3, and 4, all play a role in determining a person's risk, but they are not genetic determinants. Alzheimer's is not a genetically determined disease by and large. That means, we have to ask ourselves, what are the other factors? Well, those are environmental, meaning the foods we eat, the activities that we engage in, etc. And getting back to our inflammation discussion, then we should be asking, what are those extrinsic things that extrinsic to our genes that we expose ourselves to that may in fact enhance inflammation and therefore put us at greater risk for this disease, for which there is no treatment whatsoever, Alzheimer's disease. And I want to just mention that for a moment because in November of 2018, a study was published by a Dr. Richard Kennedy in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association network, in which he performed a meta-analysis of the common so-called Alzheimer's drugs. And there are two classes by and large, memantine and also what are called the cholinesterase inhibitors, like donepezil, and which is extremely commonly prescribed. And what he found was that these Alzheimer's drugs that are being prescribed to patients all across our country every single day, not only are ineffective, but they are associated with more rapid cognitive decline, published by the Journal of the American Medical Association. So something's not right with that. Having said that, making my point that we don't have any meaningful treatment, we should be looking at the underlying cause or causes of things like Alzheimer's. That's, the big problem as we look at neurodegenerative issues, accounting for about 5.4 million Americans right now having that disease again, for which there is no treatment, costing us about $245 billion annually, more than $1 trillion globally. And so what can we do then to perhaps prevent Alzheimer's? Let's go to the source. The source is inflammation. And by and large, the biggest cause of inflammation in humans today is diet. And the powerful instigators of this process really center on the fact that people are consuming both ultra-processed foods globally, as well as much, much more in terms of refined sugar. It's now, a study came out from University of North Carolina demonstrating that 68% of all of the 1.2 million foods sold in America's grocery store, 68% have added sugar or other sweeteners. That hacks into our primitive desire for sweet. People eat more sugar, and that amplifies inflammation. So we know that there are strong correlative studies demonstrating even subtle elevations of blood sugar, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2013 in September, demonstrated that even having a blood sugar of 105 after 6.7 years is demonstrated to have be associated with a significant risk for dementia. So even subtle elevations of blood sugar are really important. We have to take them seriously. When you go into your doctor's office and you have a blood sugar of 110 or 115, and your doctor says, well, nothing to worry about, you're not diabetic, with the word yet hanging in the air, right. It's still an issue. Even though you don't qualify as having diabetes, you haven't crossed 126, therefore everything's fine. It isn't fine. We need to keep blood sugars much lower. Having even subtle elevation of blood sugar is associated with a dramatic increased risk for becoming diabetic. If you become a diabetic, then your risk, type 2 diabetic, your risk for Alzheimer's may as much as quadruple, 4x increased risk for non-treatable disease if you have made the lifestyle choices that pave the way for type 2 diabetes. So the point is we need to do everything we can to reduce our risk of becoming a type 2 diabetic. And that is, as you well know, epidemic now in the United States, and with the westernization of our diet around the globe, it is becoming globally epidemic, particularly in Southern Asia, correlating quite closely with rates of overweight and obesity. Though we are seeing now, quite a few individuals who are TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, and having significant metabolic issues with elevation of blood sugars and fasting insulins, et cetera, that clearly are going to put them at risk for brain degeneration. So everything we can do to reduce our risk of becoming diabetic is really important. And, just as an aside, I think it's important to understand that some things are associated with increased risk of diabetes that people may not be aware of. For example, men taking a statin drug, according to the journal Diabetologia, have a 46% increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Women have a 71% increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes if they're taking a statin medication. So, that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. That was the Women's Health Initiative study, more than 150,000 women. That's pretty good data. Yeah. And that said, that's something I think people should know about when, their cholesterol's a little bit elevated and the doctor says, oh, that's a bad thing. Let's jump and put you on a statin drug. They're really safe. Well, that's not what JAMA is telling us. JAMA is describing a dramatic increased risk in women of 71% to become a type 2 diabetic that has its own health-associated issues, and also, as mentioned earlier, is associated with an increased risk for Alzheimer's. So getting back to our original discussion then, we have to do everything we can to reduce inflammation. And when we see, for example, increased risk of Alzheimer's in people who have sleep disorders, one of the mechanisms that's at play here is the remarkable increase in inflammation, in the markers of inflammation in people who do not receive adequate amounts of sleep. And I'm talking about 1/3 of American adults. Other countries have higher and lower rates. Japan, for example, it's 2/3 of adults don't receive enough restorative sleep on a nightly basis. It's associated with increased appetite, with increased obesity, increased overweight, increased inflammation, increased cortisol, poor decision-making, impulsive decision-making, and it's a feed-forward process because those issues, the obesity, for example, leads to worse sleeping. So people get deeper and deeper into a situation where they're amping up inflammation in their bodies, becoming diabetic, increasing risk for coronary artery disease, cancer, and even Alzheimer's. So that's a very important lifestyle issue that needs to be talked about.
What's defined as restorative sleep?
It's a very good question. Hours-wise, it's a bit banal, but at least 7 hours a night of sleep. But I believe it's really very fundamental for people to get a sense as to how well they are sleeping.
Yeah.
We need to get deep sleep in order to activate the lymphatic system to help take the garbage out, if you will. We need REM sleep because of its role in memory consolidation. So people may believe, for example, that they're getting a good night's rest and become very surprised when they have a sleep study, a polysomnogram, and that demonstrates that, well, as a matter of fact, they never really get a much restorative sleep because they have sleep apnea or periodic leg movements or whatever that keeps them from really dropping into restorative sleep. Yeah. So I use a wearable device called an Oura ring at night, and it has given me, there you go, some wonderful information in terms of the quality of my sleep. I know that I'm able to go to sleep. My sleep latency is measured generally in minutes, if not seconds, so I fall asleep very quickly. But I was surprised to learn that certain of my lifestyle choices kept me from getting as much deep sleep as I thought I needed. So, I made changes. I even reduced even more my caffeine consumption and moved my exercise to earlier in the day. That was helpful. Maybe other people it's not as helpful. But look, if we're supposed to sleep around 7 or 8 hours a day, 1/3 of our lives, basically, it's a lot more time than we spend eating or we should spend exercise. We don't spend 8 hours a day exercising.
Right.
You might be active and working, but it's really extremely valuable to consider the impact of sleep, which we think is wasted time in our society, and more so in, for example, Japan, that the less sleep we get, the more productive we're going to be. And that is exactly the opposite of reality. If we get better restorative sleep, we will be more productive. Yeah. This notion of trying to get ahead and being competitive by staying up and working late at night and waking up extra early, you're selling yourself short, and you will not be as productive. It's why we should let children sleep in and maybe start their school at 8:30 as opposed to 7 a.m. Because the adolescent mind requires more sleep, and the period where they get their best sleep is a bit frame shifted to be a little bit later than adults, for example. So really have to keep that in mind. And the new information about sleep, which is really exciting, is that sleep directly impacts decision making. Meaning that when we haven't received enough restorative sleep, then we are far more likely to make impulsive decisions that are only focused on immediate gratification and don't have any consideration for long-term consequence. Certainly that is important as it relates to our food choices. I'm just going to eat the donut come what may. I don't care. Or I'll choose to eat thinking about my future, thinking about how this may play out for me in the future in terms of my weight, inflammation, diabetes, whatever it may be. But it's well beyond food. It's impulsivity as it relates to how we treat other people. It compromises our empathy. It compromises compassion. So there's a lot that's involved in sleep, being able to allowing us to access the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that nurtures our ability to think about the future in terms of what we do today, that nurtures our empathic ability to think about how our actions will perhaps benefit somebody else, and even how our actions will benefit myself moving forward into the future, and even how our choices affect the planet upon which we live. So, we're extrapolating quite a bit from simply getting a good night's sleep and eating food that is lower on the inflammation scale to how people see the planet upon which they live.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna maybe go a little further here and
Please.
perhaps overstep, but I was watching the news this morning about the fires in Australia, and noticing that there were a couple of politicians in Australia who were just saying that this climate change stuff is absolutely meaningless. We shouldn't pay any attention to this information. This is just a natural thing that so much of Australia is burning up. Yeah, right. Killing 1 billion animals so far. But I'm noticing that the people who seem to be taking that position, well, you'll take a look. See what you think they look like in terms of their health measurements.
Yeah.
And there may be an observation there that may have some importance. But having said that, I believe it's really important that we understand that our decisions that are involved in looking towards the future are affected by our lifestyle choices that we make. So, we keep thinking, well, people have to make better decisions. But the reality is that we should be looking at our decision making in the first place. We as healthcare providers, yourself included, we learn as much information as we possibly can. We then transmit that information to our patients as best we can by whatever means it is, writing a book or one-on-one consultation, however works best. But then what happens is at least 50% to even higher numbers, 80% of that information doesn't get acted upon, even though we gave it to our patients with their best interest in mind, because their decision-making apparatus doesn't allow them to make those decisions. They are locked into impulsivity, and they are cut off from the prefrontal cortex, the area that allows more thoughtful decision. And we have developed a term that we are using in our new book that is called disconnection syndrome, where we have become disconnected from that part of the brain that allows us to make better, more thought out decisions.
Interesting. And pretty telling as well.
Yes, when you recognize that diet affects worldview, that the food people consume affects their mood, their decision making, and enhances an us versus them mentality, and that the global diet is being westernized, becoming pro-inflammatory, it may be an indication as to why we're seeing such incredible things happening around the world now, in terms of fear and us versus them, and just really, higher levels of aggression than are good for us. That's for sure.
So bringing this back into inflammation and oxidative stress, are there other facets to the diet that, you're talking about the glycemic components of food? Are there other foods that we know besides kind of sugar, the white death, that are inflammatory to the brain?
Yes, and I think that we should look at foods not because they contain anti-inflammatories or contain antioxidants, for that matter. Yeah. For many years, we were recommending eating this food or that food because it was high in vitamin C or the carotenoids or vitamin E, you name it. And I think that where we're moving now is to the idea that, we ought to be paying a lot more attention to our endogenous antioxidant systems. You mentioned glutathione, for example, and others, and that, we can really and robustly turn on our body's genetic machinery to crank out really higher levels of endogenous antioxidants. And I'm not saying that eating foods rich in carotenoids is a bad idea. It's a great idea. Having some vitamin C from fresh fruit, good idea. But when we understand that, for example, the cruciferous vegetables act to enhance ultimately our production of things like sulforaphane through action of certain enzymes like myrosinase, enhancing our body's production or availability of sulforaphane in our bodies, and how that then activates certain pathways like the NRF2 pathway that then activate a whole variety of gene pathways that reduce inflammation, that increase antioxidant production, and also enhance with our ability to detoxify. We know that glutathione S transferase is one of those detoxification enzymes that ultimately is activated when we consume cruciferous vegetables. And how can we get more out of that? Well, we realize that, yeah, cruciferous vegetables are great, but the sprouts of cruciferous vegetables are better. That eating, for example, broccoli sprouts, wonderful source of glucoraphanin that we then, when we chew broccoli sprouts, are able to activate an enzyme, myrosinase, to turn that into sulforaphane. This is some powerful stuff. I mean, I am not going to say that that sulforaphane has proven anti-cancer activity, but at least if we look at laboratory animal studies, it is certainly suggested. And I think that your viewers should explore that. And if not, at least maybe think about the recommendation to eat more of the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, kale, cauliflower, so many others that are out there that cabbage, we don't even think of as cruciferous, but it is. So these are ways that we harvest our body's ability to protect itself by making its own antioxidants, by increasing its ability to deal with inflammation through certain pathways. And also, as you alluded to much earlier, increased ability to detoxify. We live in a, call it like it is, a pretty toxic world wherever we are. You could be in Antarctica and there's still evidence of toxins floating around the ocean, that's for sure.
Yeah.
You can't get away from it. So if you can't get away from it, I mean, there are things you can do to minimize your exposure, living not close to a busy highway, for example. But we ought to do whatever we can to enhance our ability to offload that stuff. And that's why cruciferous vegetables seem to be so beneficial and so highly recommended these days.
I love that. So, Dr. Perlmutter, you're recommending eat your vegetables.
Eat your broccoli, yeah. That's right.
I love that. I love that. In closing, are there any other pearls of wisdom or message that you would love to share with our viewers and listeners? This has been an awesome discussion, and I'm just wondering, just at the end here, if there's some other words of wisdom that you'd like to share.
I would want to increase your viewers' consideration that in many ways we should be looking at the notion of reconnection. And what do I mean by that? I mean, as a watchword. We should be thinking, as I mentioned earlier, about reconnecting to that part of the brain that allows us to be empathetic and compassionate and plan for the future. Reconnecting to the prefrontal cortex. We should be reconnecting to the life-sustaining and health-sustaining messages that come from our DNA. We, to a significant degree, control the expression of our DNA, either amplifying the expression of genes that are good for us or genes that may be doing us harm. Reconnecting to the importance of our gut bacteria, understanding that our gut microbiota is making important chemicals that go throughout our bodies, help our brain function well, help reduce inflammation, help quell free radicals as well by enhancing antioxidant production, for example. That we should consider the notion of reconnection as it relates to ourselves, reconnecting to our goals, reconnecting to our families, our neighbors, our communities, and reconnecting to people who have views that may not be in exact alignment with our own. We call that empathy. Empathy is being able to walk the mile in somebody else's shoes and see the world, though it may be uncomfortable, through the eyes of another individual. And these days things seem to be going not in that direction. We're becoming more and more polarized, and it's we need to interrelate with each other to have resilience with respect to the earth changes that are happening. And finally, I'd say reconnect to the planet. People fall on one side or the other of that discussion, and I obviously have my views, and you know where I fall in terms of that discussion. But any discussion of our health and longevity must include the health and vitality and resilience of the planet upon which we live. So I think that we're seeing a lot of climatic changes happening now, and I think it's really brought to me in really stark clarity that this needs to be emphasized by people like yourself, with all due respect, in the position of providing healthcare, that it goes beyond the one-on-one with the patient, that real preventive medicine begins at looking at the health of the planet that upon which we live, whose survival we depend upon. So I guess that would be the closing message.
That's awesome, and full on in agreement and alignment. Without a healthy planet, when we're just looking at individuals and their health, of course we're part of the planet, right? So that connection is so strong and evident and apparent, and that is exactly why we are producing a summit like this and having experts such as yourself and having these discussions. And I really appreciate that very powerful message at the end. Thank you, Dr. Perlmutter.
Really, thank you for having me on today. I sure do appreciate it.